Hello and welcome to MPG's ABA webinar series. There's a little bit about MPG for you to read when you have a chance. I'm Anita D'Abbraccio. I'm a BCBA, and I'll be presenting today on classroom support systems and leveraging ABA for better outcomes. I find this information very important to share with you because it was a big part of my career in a classroom for students with severe emotional behavioral issues. And I ended up implementing some strategies that are ABA compliant across the school setting. And that was pretty significant in the amount of positive change we saw. So it's very important to me that I sort of disseminate this information to other BCBAs who can then share it with administrators and teachers and hopefully see some positives in their schools and classrooms. So today I won't be using a whole lot of BCBA language for exactly that reason. I really want for what I'm sharing with you to be in the same language that I would share it with a teacher. And I have done that quite a lot. And so I sort of know what is more easy for them to digest and understand and incorporate into their teacher world. So I won't be using a lot of BCBA language, but I will be using a lot of the language that I used to help teachers understand this material better. I, in my early career, worked in group homes and was trained by a behavior specialist, a behavior consultant who was well-versed in ABA. Although we didn't call it that at the time, I had lots of other trainings through the organizations I worked for in positive behavior management. There wasn't the oversight that there is now. I'm talking about 30 years ago, but I learned a lot of the basic principles, and I ended up using those throughout my life and in my future careers, especially when I landed in a classroom as a substitute teacher, and that classroom was for students with severe emotional behavioral disturbances. I, day one, could see that here in this public school setting is a really good place to apply behavior analysis to great effect. So after day one, as a sub, I said I would really like to have this class, and I was hired on as the permanent teacher, and I worked in that role, although in different schools. I worked in that role for over 20 years and continued to use ABA the entire time and to try to learn more about it and to disseminate that information to my fellow teachers and to administrators in and outside of my school. When administrators noticed that the toughest kids would be sent to me, but would quickly make great gains, they asked why, and I explained why. And I said, I really use the science of behavior. And at the same time, I treat students and families with a great deal of respect. And that combination seemed to have a really good outcome. And eventually I was asked to leave my classroom and take on the responsibility of a whole school behavior reform, of leading the whole school behavior reform for a K-8 inner city school that I was working at. And I was a little reluctant to do that because my classroom was running along quite smoothly. I had a wonderful assistant, and I knew I was going to be taking on a really big challenge. But I did feel like I had been preaching this for so long that I needed to put my heart and my time where my mouth was. So I left the classroom and I became the behavior coordinator and the leader of this behavior reform for this very troubled school. We had a lot of behaviors, a lot of issues, a lot to correct. And I was excited to see if my hypothesis that ABA could be applied in an antecedent systems type of way to good effect in a whole school environment. I wanted to see if that would work. And so they gave me all of the hall monitors and some what we called community connectors as part of what we called the behavior team. But I also trained all of the staff and all of the administrators in a new approach to how we handled behavior and discipline. And it's important to me today that I share that information with you in a way that helps you disseminate it to other schools and maybe helps other schools get some relief, especially if they're in that category of a really struggling school. So when we did this, we kind of looked at things in stages. And so the first stage was the tier 1 host school systems, where we created a common response to typical behaviors that we would see in school. So loitering, out of class, running in the halls, fighting, talking back, disruption, all sorts of things. We really had a very difficult school. So there was a lot for us to look at. And this is part of a 3-part series, and that was the focus of the first presentation, was that whole school piece. And then this presentation will be covering the classroom management system that we developed as a common classroom management approach across all of the classrooms in the building. And that's what we're going to focus on today. And it is built on positive supports and neutral redirection, as are those other supports that we put into the systems, the whole school systems. And then lastly, the next presentation after this will be regarding individualized interventions for those students who have extra needs beyond what can be met by the classroom management system, and who might need an FBA, and who need some programming that meet student-specific needs. So looking at those different tiers and approaching it from an ABA perspective, we were able to change a lot about the way we handled discipline and behavior, and we sort of changed the perspective on who was responsible. So right from the beginning, I was asking for a shift in thinking around who's responsible for student behavior. Historically, we've always felt like parents and families and the kids are responsible for how the kids act at school. And I sometimes get some argument about that. But when we were doing this, we recognized that we had students who did not come with the resources to be successful at school unless we gave them a certain level of support initially. And then the point of all of that is that we eventually fade that support and we increase the students' capacity and increase the responsibility and the accountability. But initially, the shift was that we were taking responsibility for providing as much support as is necessary for students to be successful in our school. And we did a whole lot of things around that I'm going to share with you today, and that I will share in those other 2 presentations. This is a good visual for what the results were of this initiative. The 2018-2019 school year, you can see we had almost 4,000 incidents, office referrals. The 2019-2020 school year was actually a truncated school year because we were only there for 3/4 of that school year due to COVID. The following school year, 2020-2021, we only had a very limited number of students in school in person. The rest were attending virtually. So that's why we see this huge dip here. And then the next school year was our first full school year, and comparable, you can see the difference between our last full school year, 2018-2019, and 2021-2022. And actually this school year here was on trend to be much higher. So we had a really big impact on the number of incidents that students were being written up for. And then the following year, we saw another big decrease, and that trend has continued. I stay in touch with people in the school, and that trend has continued since I left a year ago. So I just like that slide because it really shows that there was quite the impact. Today I'm going to discuss the classroom system that we ended up utilizing across classrooms. But initially during this reform, we kind of left it up to the teachers to figure out how they wanted to manage their classrooms. And we quickly realized that that wasn't going to work. It wasn't working very well, that our teachers needed more training and understanding around the science of behavior before they could really implement their own. And we didn't have time for that. And we also wanted as much uniformity in our responses to behavior as we could manage. So we ended up developing a structured system that incorporated our common responses to behavior that we were using in the whole school. And now we were going to duplicate those within the classroom. And that really streamlined things, and it helped things, although the teachers were a little resistant initially. Many of them got quite good at this system that I'm about to share and found it to be the reason for them starting to enjoy their job again and starting to have fun with their students again. And that's why disseminating this is so important to me. I do think that there is a great deal of need there in our schools for some relief around behavior especially. So what we did was to use the general concepts, general ADA principles to develop the system. And it's important to me that I note for everybody in the audience that while ADA can sometimes be received reluctantly or critically, that it really ended up being quite compassionate. It had some very good outcomes and qualities in the way we implemented it. And I think it was overall a very good relationship building piece. So the way that we implemented things, it was quite compassionate. We required sort of looking at students and whether or not their basic needs were being met. That was our initial response. So we said, is this student does he have some medical need? Is there a hunger issue? Is there a thirst issue? Is there a sleep issue? Is there a pain issue? What are the basic needs and have they been met? And if they haven't, then we did what we could to meet them. And it removes the responses that are relationship damaging. So I feel like that's a compassionate piece. We're not being critical of students and we're not having negative conversations with them. It's much more neutral or positive. And it does require, and it does build student accountability, and it increases student capacity, which to me, in the long run, is the most compassionate thing we can do. It also is based on understanding. There are techniques built in that give space for calibrating our responses to students, understanding that some students' processing time is slower, that some students are coming to us with underdeveloped behavior and social skills, and we are recognizing that and putting the responsibility initially on the adults to provide whatever support students need to be as maximally successful as possible, and to do that while those new skills are being taught. So there's a very important piece of understanding the student perspective built in. It's also trauma safe because it focuses on antecedent interventions that tend to be positive and proactive and preventative. And it protects that student-teacher relationship by using only positives or neutral responses. It's built on these 5 Ps of positives, prevention, prediction, protocol, and practice. I could go into more detail on those, but I don't have time in this presentation. But those are cornerstone pieces of the program that we used. Using positive reinforcement, I will talk about quite a bit later on. Looking at prevention, a good example of that is that I had a classroom one year that had a sink in it, and I was going to have 10 new students in the classroom who all had, impulse issues and social, emotional, behavioral issues. And so I thought a sink in the classroom might not be the best thing for them initially. And so I put my desk in front of it and I had the staff turn the water off. But eventually the sink became an important piece of our classroom functioning. We used it appropriately, but initially I made sure that was not a draw for negative behavior. And There's a lot of protocol built in. We have really prescribed ways of addressing student behavior so that there isn't any guesswork, that everybody knows what's expected, what's going to happen next. And we put a lot of practice into it because these were new things, and we need practice when we're using different interventions, or when we're initially teaching students things or initially teaching adults things. So there was a lot of practice involved as well. The interventions themselves and the strategies and the structure are designed around the most common functions of typical student misbehaviors within the school. And those tend to be escape, avoidance, or attention. And so all of our responses to behavior were designed such that they didn't provide escape, avoidance, or undue attention to an undesired behavior. And that was key to the changes that we saw. So the system specifics, this is the money slide. This is where kind of the crux of it is, and where everything is laid out as simply, all the elements are laid out as simply as possible. And some of them I haven't reviewed yet. I will review them shortly, but these are all the components in the classroom management system that we were using. The first one being positives. Again, I will go over those more shortly. The second is a whole class cue, and that cue being connected to a neutral consequence in the form of check marks. Next was neutral redirection, so that when a student needs to be corrected or told to do something or retold to do something, that it's done in a neutral manner that doesn't feed the behavior and that doesn't damage the relationship. That each classroom has, as part of its classroom management plan, a component of time-based incentive, daily and weekly time-based incentive. So a period at the end of the day, a period at the end of the week where preferred activities occur. And those check marks and that consequence are related to those incentive times. And the hierarchy of consequences. So you start out with just the 5 count and the consequence check marks if a student doesn't comply within the 5 count. After 3 times, we move to 3 check marks, again, using the 5 count, equals a loss of letter in a descriptor of the weekly time-based incentive. And after 3 of those, we stop because we don't want to be in a cycle, and we don't want to be in a power struggle. If you get to 3, you're probably going to keep going, and the student will lose everything in one day, and we don't want that. The next step, if we get to that point, is once 3 letters are lost from the word, a phone call home, planned ignoring, or if necessary, an office disciplinary referral. The planned ignoring is, of course, only if you can do that, given the level of disruption or danger the behavior might present. So that's the system. And I'm going to get into the nitty gritty of the system and how that looks, but I wanted to start with that. So positives. This is foundational to everything that we did and everything I ever did in my classroom, everything that I've ever done in any educational setting has been focused on heavy, heavy positives, initially, especially with a lot of front loading of those positives. It was my goal, and it became the whole school's goal, to be exhibiting 90% of our interactions with students as positive interactions, positive reinforcement, positive verbalizations, and only 10% as redirection or correction. And even that 10% was meant to be neutral, so that we weren't being harsh or unkind or angry or frustrated. So, and that's not always easy to do. That's a pretty big percentage to expect, but especially initially in the school year, I would just be constantly saying positives so the students didn't have a chance to exhibit those negative behaviors and get accidentally reinforced by a response to those. And then over time, we were able to fade the positives. But I will say that every year around February, I would feel like my class was slipping a little, or I was getting frustrated, and I would ask my assistant, what do you think it is? And it took us a few years to realize it was every year around February, she would say, yeah, you're not being very positive anymore. And I would actually ask her to track me and tell me what the ratio was so that I could work on it and so I could get myself back up to that percentage, because I knew how key it was. And that was something we worked on as a whole school. We really focused on frequent behavior-specific verbal praise initially, especially. So if you saw a student come in and put their backpack up right away, you would verbalize that as a positive, as a comment that helps you to get into class on time and makes the school run smoother, whatever you want to say that is a positive and a good connection with the student. And we noticed at one point we went in as administrators, we went in and we monitored, we did probes in classrooms, and we tracked how many times the teacher used behavior-specific verbal praise. And we did several different visits and observations, and then we collected the data and we looked at it. And when I looked at that, I could see that the teacher with the highest number of behavior-specific verbal praise had the lowest number of ODRs. And when we charted it, it was actually it was inverse. It was the higher the number of praises, the lower the number of ODRs. And that was really telling to us and important to share with the staff. And they were motivated by that when they could see it visually. And we had an initiative around increasing those where we were kind of helping each other do that because it was so powerful. Frequent positive reinforcement in other forms, such as a pat on the back, a gestural, such as a thumbs up, a smile, facial expression, all of those things were also harder to track, but also important to maintaining positive interactions with the students and letting the students know when they were exhibiting behaviors we wanted to see. So in addition to that, we had a visual positive in each classroom for out of the norm behaviors. So in my classroom, it was a chart with the kids' names on it, and there was what we called D'Abbraccio dollars, but it was tally marks, and they could, for any tally mark earned, that was sort of equal to $1, and they could spend it at the school, at our classroom store. And so that was quite fun, but it also gave us an opportunity to recognize individual growth. The student who doesn't typically shares one day, and we make sure that we give some praise around that, and we give the D'Abbraccio dollar and make sure they can see that they have that, and it sort of stays there until they get to turn it in, and they watch them accumulate. So it's very motivating. We did that for whole class rewards. If we had a fire drill and everybody did great, then the whole class would get a tally. We did it sometimes for individuals, and the absence of a target behavior we were focusing on, as well as the group. Maybe, we're looking to decrease the number of verbal altercations. We might use it for that purpose. And all of that, again, is connected to an incentive. In my classroom, it was an incentive to shop. It was dollars to shop at our classroom store with. And we made that fun for them too. The store they had a lot of input in it, and they had a lot of fun with it. So those are the positives, and they're very important to the success that we experienced, and in my opinion, to the success of any classroom. We also used as a key factor, a key element in this reform and in the way that we handled classroom management, was using a whole class cue. And that's the 5 count. We chose that because that's what I used for over 2 decades, and it was very effective. I kind of honed it to fine art, and I wanted to share with folks how that worked in my classroom, and they were able to replicate it quite easily. Well, I won't say easily. They were able to replicate it well after practice. So the way that protocol looks is that you give a direction, everybody get your math book, you wait 30 seconds or so, give them time to kind of process and understand what it is that they've been asked to do. Begin counting down from 5 to 1. If in the middle of your countdown, you have some students who are still not quite on track to have completed the request before you get to 1, then it's okay to give a warning with another verbal direction, such as, we're looking for math books out, or there will be a check mark. You do this in a very calm, neutral tone, and you only do it once. And then when you reach 1, it's very handy to have a clicky pen. I always had a clicky pen with me, because if they heard the click, they would very often hurry up to get their work, to accomplish whatever was asked and avoid the check mark. And I was fine with that. And so if you reach 1 and there's somebody who's not on task, then you can click your pen and you give just one check mark, and that one check mark will come into play during that daily or weekly time-based incentive. Again, none of this is done with any anger or talking or it's just done with a very calm and neutral tone. And the beauty of this is that it gives the teacher a little ability to calibrate the 5 count. So I've had classes where there are kids who are really quick processors and they can all get on task pretty fast, except maybe one. And that one student, I could, if I knew they were doing their best and proceeding as well as they can, I would slow my count down so that they would meet the requested, whatever was requested, before getting a tally or a check mark. And I could also speed it up as the year went on and they got used to the system. And I didn't want to waste any instructional time. I could count quite fast. And once they were used to it, and my guys who were slower in processing were accustomed to it, then I could speed it up. So it's really nice to have that ability to calibrate and to give students the time to process, because a lot of our students need that. I also made it a game, and I practiced initially when I first started teaching this to teachers and to my class. We made it a game, and we said, kids here, teacher here. Every time I 5 count, if you are all on task by one, you get a point. If you're not, I get a point. Silly, simple thing, but it really got a lot of buy-in, built the classroom culture. And by the end of the school year, I was not doing 5 counts. I might say the word 5. If I wanted my class to do something, they would typically do it. I would say 5. I might not even get to 4 or 3. But it was a very effective and a positive culture approach. Another piece that we found necessary and important was finding a way to direct students to be on task or to do the things that they're meant to do without feeding that function of attention. So a lot of times a student would be off task and teachers would be giving a lot of time and attention to that student who was off task and feeding the behavior, definitely making it more likely that behavior would recur. So we approached this a little differently. We taught the teachers that they would, when a student was off task, they would give the student one verbal instruction to attend to the designated activity or direction. If the student did not comply within 20 seconds, the teacher would turn their head away and avoid eye contact. So if the teacher would only use gestural cues such as tapping the work on the desk or pointing in the direction of this or where the expectation is. And anytime the student started to exhibit any behavior toward engaging in the activity that they were directed to, the teacher starts to turn back, turns their head toward them, might give them a little smile, might give them a thumbs up or quiet verbal praise. So for example, if you're sitting elbow to elbow with the student and they're not willing to do their work, their pencil and paper work, let's say, then whoever's sitting next to that student, and I did a lot of training with one-on-ones for this because it's so effective, they would give direction to do number 1, point to the paper, give them a couple seconds. If they're not complying, turn their head away. You're still kind of using your periphery. Point to the paper again. Once the student starts to, and no verbals, nothing else, just sort of turned away, but pointing to what they need to do. If they pick up their pencil, you can turn your head back. If they start to write, you can turn your body back. If they actually do the problem, you can give them a thumbs up or a pat on the back or something, some quiet verbal praise. And let's say it's a math activity. If at the end of the math time, if the student hasn't completed that work, then that work can be moved into an unfinished work folder, and the teacher's not going to scold or lecture. We're not going to discuss the work. We're not going to threaten or predict that they're going to be sorry they didn't do it. We're just going to slip it in a red folder, the unfinished work folder, and that will be completed during those time-based incentives as well. So we are making sure that students have some expectation to do their work and to be responsible and have some accountability. And that has been very successful as well. So the daily time-based incentive is just a chunk of time at the end of the day, 15 to 30-minute block, where a preferred activity will be in place for the students. It's got to be fun. You got to keep it fresh. You have to get student input. We always used it for greater behavior growth. We had a lot of demands on the behavior we expected to see during these times. It is related to those those check marks that happen as a result of a 5 count. So if the student has check marks that they need to serve, then they sit at the beginning of the time-based incentive. They sit at their desk, and a timer is set for however many minutes they owe. And once that timer is off, they're allowed to join the group doing the time-based incentive, and without lecturing or scolding. Their time is up and they can go do that. Unless they have work to do. If they have work to do, that work has to be finished prior to going to join the group. So this is a really potent piece. It gives weight to the 5 count. It gives weight to the teacher's direction, and it gives weight to the work that they're expected to do. It's important that when we're giving work, we make sure they can do it, that they're getting the help they need to do it, but we also want to make sure that they are being accountable for it. So this is a component of the classroom management plan that we made universal in the school. And even at the middle school level, it was just it was a smaller, shorter period of time at the end of each class period with all the same rules and regulations around it. So the weekly time-based incentive is sort of your Fun Friday type of idea. And the teacher establishes a word to represent this, and it's visual. It's somewhere in the room visually next to students' names. It can be Fun Friday, it can be Brain Break, it can be whatever the class chooses, but it should be fadeable. It should be something you can break down. So Fun Friday, you can switch to just Friday. Brain Break, I always use Brain Break, and I switched it to just Break. That was before people used Brain Break in another context in the educational setting, so that's a little different now. But I would still use Brain Break if I were still teaching, or you can let the class choose. But it needs to have enough letters that initially even your toughest student has a chance to achieve that incentive. So then it's written next to each student's name in a way that allows for erasing or removal of the letter if they've gone through the 3 check marks and they've moved on to the 3 letters being removed based on a 5 count and a direction that perhaps they're having some trouble complying with. Once the student has gone through those, and we've removed 3 letters, then we stop. We don't do that. So the next time around, perhaps they'll lose 3 more letters, perhaps they'll only lose 1, but we don't take all the letters away in any given episode. So you only go to 3. After 3, you're moving on to something like planned ignoring or a phone call home. And at the end of the week, if there is even just 1 letter left, the student has access to the end of the week reward once all of that day's check marks are finished and all the work is completed for that day. And if those things are done, the student has access even if they only have 1 letter. If they've lost all of their letters, then they do not have access, and they will do unfinished work or some other less preferred activity than whatever the Brain Break is. So let's say we did Fun Friday for our classroom. The important part of Fun Friday is that it's fun. We really want this end of week incentive to be engaging, to be motivating, and to be a hook to get kids to really care whether they have their letters or they don't have their letters. So it needs to be fun. We got really creative. We did a lot of fun things. We made butter, we made flapjacks, we made it academic. We connected it to lessons we were learning in the classroom. We recognized that students learn through fun, and so we gave them a lot of ownership over what are we going to do next? What are you interested in? Sometimes they would choose digging for dinosaur eggs, and we would get one of those kits. And there was all sorts of things that were sort of super fun, but also there was an educational component. And we also used it because I was in a classroom teaching social skills and behavior skills. I used it very often, and even our regular education teachers were using it to as a hook to maximize behavior growth. So really pushing that community and that collaboration and the way we talk to people and the way we shared and the way we work together through the really cool things we were doing, but also knowing that if you were involved in this really cool activity and you weren't behaving in a way that we had described as necessary, then you would sit out for a period of time. And again, I said, you can fade the word, you can shorten it over the course of the school year, and it should be faded over the course of the school year so that it's challenging students to up their game when it comes to their behavior. And again, it's time-based. It's important to be really careful about timing those minutes and being consistent with giving the students the full amount of time that is part of the incentive. So sometimes teachers push into that, but if you do that, then it loses its potency for students. So it's really important to keep that time base consistent. And those clear expectations, again, to use as a social skill, lesson and practice. Another component of the interventions that we were using is that there was a hierarchy of consequences, and we start here, this is what happens first, then we go to this is what we do next, then we go to this. And that really helped to eliminate some of the confusion for teachers around what works, what doesn't work, what should I try this time, trial and error, hit or miss approach to behavior, which happens a lot in classrooms. And the other benefits are that it was neutral, non-relationship damaging, and requires the student to accept responsibility without diminishing that relationship. And teachers liked that. Teachers need to see that we are requesting that students do take on some responsibility and ownership. So we had the 5 check marks, we had the loss of 3 letters, we had the 3 check marks, and the loss of 3 letters being a phone call home or planned ignoring. We had the loss of letter being maybe a disciplinary referral, and the potential to lose your Fun Friday if you don't have any letters left. And of course, the check marks equal to the 1 minute. But there was this hierarchy. The kids kind of knew that being off track was increasing the consequence, the weight of the consequence that they were going to receive. And that became very motivating to them. They understood it, and they would respond quite quickly to an upping of the ante, as it were. So I hope in the next couple of sessions to talk about some other things, but I did want to share quickly a few things right now that I used in my classroom that fall in line with the things that I'm teaching today, because they are all those things that I keep saying: neutral, non-relationship damaging. They address the behavior without feeding the function of the behavior. But they're also just good strategies that can help teachers to handle big situations. So I'll start with the deal in DEAR. We created and started to implement this approach to big behaviors. Sometimes we would be in a classroom where a student had an explosive behavior, and it was problematic, and it could cause teachers a lot of anxiety to wonder, how am I going to keep the student safe? How am I going to help this child de-escalate? What am I going to do to resolve this situation? And maybe, maybe still have some instruction time left to actually teach today. And so as I started to teach these strategies and teachers began to use them, they found them quite powerful, and they started to get good at implementing them, and it decreased the teacher's anxiety around student behavior. So with DEAR, it stands for drop everything and read. And in my classroom and in these classrooms where the teachers are using this, all of the students have a book that they're very interested in their desk, or several books in their desk. It's not part of, read to self or anything else. It's sort of kept there. We refresh them every once in a while, but they're kept there for the event, in the event that we need them for a DEAR episode. So I would use DEAR when I saw antecedent behaviors in a student that indicated the student was about to have a much larger behavior, of an explosive behavior. And if I would say to the students, DEAR, All I had to say was dear. Everybody knew, and it never failed because we practiced it ahead of time many times. And we would practice it, like if we were getting a new student, I would practice it with them, just to refresh it and make sure that they remembered that this was a thing we did, because over the course of the year, we didn't have to do it very much once we had kind of gotten our bearings. So I would say, dear, everybody would stop whatever they were doing, drop everything, and they would head to their desk, sit in their desk, and they would begin to read those books. That gave me and my assistant time to address the behavior, to use the strategies, especially if it was a student who had an individualized behavior plan, to use those strategies with that student with fidelity, because everybody else was contained and safe and quiet. They knew that if they did this, that they would get a very big reward. It could be pizza, it could be a cake, it would be something, and it usually was food. But it could also be an extra recess or something if food isn't an option. So drop everything and read. They would do that. They would read until we told them, either until we knew it was too long to ask of them to read, or until we told them that they could go back to what they had been doing, and they would get reinforced. And we would have resolved the issue with the other student. So it isolated the movement of those other kids in the classroom while we attended to the student who was escalating. And that was a very, very effective strategy. The deal piece was drop everything and leave. If the student was escalating quickly and violently, and we were afraid that somebody might get hurt, we would say drop everything and leave. And there was a basket by the door that had puzzles and coloring and crayons and books and things like that. And the students knew to take that basket and to go to a pre-designated location. And they would go to that location and they would sit down and they would begin to work on whatever was there as a group, or individually, but the group would work on their own thing in that new location. So for example, we had a 5th grade teacher who was very good with our students. We would send them to her outside her classroom. We would walkie that they were coming, and somebody would come and monitor them, or she would open her door and monitor them. And they had always a pizza party coupon at the bottom of that. And if the teacher who was monitoring them said they did a good enough job, they would get that pizza party coupon and be able to turn that in for a class pizza party once we had resolved whatever the issue was in the classroom. There's a whole bunch of things in my bag of tricks that include strategies that take the power out of the behavior. And those two strategies keep kids safe. They take the power out of the student who's escalating out of their behavior because they don't have the audience, and the teacher can remain a whole lot calmer when they feel like they have a plan to keep their students safe. I did mention in the DEAR, when I was describing DEAR, that in isolating student movement is a really important first step to addressing some behaviors. So we had a group of little 2nd graders who were little boys who just fought. They fought all the time at recess. And we didn't want to keep taking recess away. Kids need recess. They needed to run. They needed to have fun. But I did want to address this behavior. And so I had the staff who were out there look for any antecedent behavior to fighting. So screaming, chasing, and I think we had one more. I can't remember what it was, but there were sort of 3 indicators that if they started those, then we would remove them for 1 minute. They would sit on the bench for 1 minute and they could go right back to playing as soon as they were removed. And that isolated their movement. It kept them away from those students that they were aggravating or potentially about to aggravate. It let them reset, and it helped us keep an eye sort of on where everybody was. And once they were reset, they got sent right back so they could play and do their thing. And if it happened again, or if it happened with some other student, they would come and get a quick reset. And that isolating of the movement really helps. In our middle school, we had a big, huge gym that actually had 4 gym classes in it. And so we had 4 classes of middle school kids with bleachers and basketballs and a stage. And there was just a whole lot of chaos in there. And when I did a reform, because as we looked at our data, we could see that, their gym class is a place where we're having a lot of fights, we're having a lot of issues. What can we do to fix it? So I went and I did some observations, and we changed how we handled that environment. And we isolated when this is an antecedent intervention, right? We isolated the students' movement by giving them designated places to sit when they came in, by enforcing that expectation with some consequences, and by keeping students either participating and on the floor or in their designated location where they could be monitored much more easily. And that really had a big impact on the number of incidents and fights we had in gym. So that's another bag of tricks thing. One of the things that I would share quickly to kind of in the realm of de-escalation is the strategy of sometimes I would get kids coming in and they would be very, very upset because something had happened at recess, and they would just be really aggravated and agitated and pacing, yelling, screaming, maybe punching the walls, who knows. But I would slip them a pencil and a piece of paper and I would say, I can see you're really upset and I want to come back and help you. But for right now, I have to go over here and teach. Can you please write down what happened? And so they would be really aggravated and agitated, and they would be kind of huffing and puffing, and they would take the pen and the paper and they would be really mad, and then they would try to write, and it's really hard to stay escalated and write. And so they would really mad, and then they'd go and they would start writing, and it would immediately kind of calm them down because they had to calm down to write. But in the meantime, they were sharing with me things that were important and that I did want to help them with if they needed help. Or they would look at it and they'd start writing and they would be like, they didn't really like to write and they didn't really want to write anymore. And it suddenly wasn't as important as it had been. So that's another little trick that I used that is carefully designed to not feed the behavior, the negative side of the behavior, to give a positive behavior that you can then respond to without teaching the student that yelling and screaming is going to get them what they want, or that a tantrum is going to help them get the attention they need. So that was another trick that I used quite often. Another one that I think is helpful to share with teachers, because all of this gives them a little power over behavior, and behavior can be so anxiety inducing, right? So all of these fit within the framework that I've already shared. It fits within that, but it's just a little extra that helps you maybe avoid needing to do a 5 count or avoid needing to give a consequence, maybe to diffuse a situation. So a student who maybe isn't in their seat and is seeking attention but isn't in their seat, and they aren't responding to the 5 count, I would say very often to them, I can't see you or hear you unless you're in your seat. And I would stick to it. I wouldn't see them or hear them. I wouldn't respond to anything else they said. Once I had given that directive, I might give it another time or two with some time in between, just to let them know they're not getting anything from me unless they're in their seat. I can't see you or hear you unless you're in your seat. And quite often what would happen is that they would kind of slip over, sit in their seat quickly, and immediately I would say, "What's up? How are you? What can I do for you?" And give them a little bit of attention. But then typically I would say, okay, I'm going to see what I can do to help you with that. But first I need you to get your book out or whatever. Give them something to do that is a positive behavior that then I can give some more attention to. But that initial sitting down is the positive behavior that I am giving some attention to initially. And then we can kind of build some more support and interaction as is appropriate. So that's another one that we used quite often in my classroom. I will say, if you have a really, really literal student, it's not the best strategy because sometimes a really, really literal student will get upset about that notion that you can't, that yes, of course you can see them, or they will freak out because why can't you see them? You should be able to see them. And I've only had that happen once or twice, but it was pretty impactful. I remembered I need to be careful about my literal kiddos. Another piece that I teach frequently when I'm teaching classroom management is the importance of transitions and putting supports in for transitions, and not just expecting kids to be able to go from gym to a math class without some extra support for a successful transition and a really ready brain to work. And so if they were coming from PE class, or if they were coming from recess or lunch or some other unstructured setting, and they were coming into class, and we were, especially if we were going to have to do something quite academic or seat and paperwork, I would have something on their desks. They knew this was protocol. I would have something on their desk for them to do. Sometimes it would be a word search, but because I taught, for the most part, younger kids, and they love to color. Also, older kids love to color. So that worked often with older kids too. I would have coloring pages that they had picked out. During our Fun Fridays, we would often choose what coloring pages we were going to do for the following week. So they were engaged in them. But I would have them on the desk, each individual desk, with the materials out. I didn't give them the option to get their things. It was ready for them. If I knew they were coming from recess and it was early in the year and I knew transitions were problematic, I had the things they needed for a highly preferred activity that looks like academic work in their seat. And they would sit down and they would begin coloring, and we might play some soft music, and we would do that maybe for 5 or 10 minutes. We did it in the morning, we did it after lunch, and we did it after PE if we needed it. And that just sort of centered everybody. And then once that was accomplished, once we had finished 5 or 10 minutes of this sort of calm, centering activity, then we would move into our more academic time. And we would do that quite successfully because everybody had sort of shifted gears. And that was a good strategy too. I hope these last few strategies were helpful to you as examples of things that we can teach that are ABA appropriate, that don't feed negative behaviors, and that will give students and teachers some greater support and success around behavior. And I'm really hoping that that classroom management piece is something that you can at least find parts of that would be useful in your schools, and maybe even the whole thing. So I appreciate your time, and I hope to see you in my next presentation. Thank you.